All right. Welcome back, everyone, to the lecture for this week. As I teased in the intro, we're going to talk about the critical analysis, which is the third essay, or the third part of the larger essay that is our big research paper. So, yeah, this is going to be a little bit of a different one because we're going to be talking about a host of different things. We are going to talk about the assignment sheet, so bear with me. But yeah, so welcome to Critical Analysis and the Ghosts of Tappic and Kelp. So this is where I say real quick, for anybody who's not had me for intro, for English Comp 1, you are probably unfamiliar with Tappic and Kelp. If you have had me for English Comp 1, I told you we'd keep coming back to it in English classes. Apologies, I don't know why Adobe decided to run something now, but anyway. So, very specifically, if you've heard of the rhetorical situation and the rhetorical appeals, you know what Tappic and Kelp are. If you don't recall what those are, we will be going over them again, okay? Tappic and Kelp are just the ways that I came up with years ago for Tappic, and then Kelp was only a few years ago, but they were little cheeky fun ways to remember them. So now that you've had me, you're going to get to know them too, which is why the fish and everything, because Kelp. Anyway, so we're talking about critical analysis. And so the critical analysis, and I want to emphasize, this is what the assignment is, and we're going to look at the assignment sheet here when we're finished with this one slide, and then we'll be doing the rest is just lecture in the slideshow, okay? So critical analysis is an in-depth, close evaluation of a single source that is intended for use in your final research paper. That is what we are doing. That is the focus. So if you think about it this way, the first thing was the proposal where you propose what you want to do. The second thing was the annotated bibliography where you gather 10 sources. Critical analysis is now where you're taking one of those 10 sources and you're going to go super in depth and looking at just that one source, and you're going to be analyzing it. You're going to be seeing how effective, how useful it is. So you're going to be doing rhetorical analysis, which is how it's written, a values-based, and you're also doing a critical analysis where you're doing the source as a whole and its impact. It's the combination of those two things. It's important to note the difference, but at the same time, they are closely connected. So we're going to look at the assignment sheet here in just a second, so bear with me. Okay, so here we have, right here on Blackboard, it's under the Week 5 folder. So Week 5 intro video, your readings, your journal entry, your critical analysis, and the lecture, and then the lecture video will be right above it. But so critical analysis, when you click on this and start the submission, this is what you're going to see. This is the guidelines for it, okay? And so very importantly, choose a source from your annotated bibliography to analyze in depth in an essay of at least 3 pages, okay? I'm going to tell you the same thing I tell every student every semester who asks. Don't worry about the page numbers. Just worry about doing what I'm asking you to do, and I promise you it'll be fine, okay? But I want you to look at one source, and I want you to analyze it in depth. This should be a source that you plan on using extensively in your research essay, not something you're just going to pull one quote from, something you're actually going to use. So this should be a source you plan on using extensively. Perhaps it's foundational to the other areas of research on your topic, or maybe it's essential to answering your research question and providing, examples, some evidence. In any case, your analysis should address how evidence and conclusions are presented in this source, so in the original piece, as well as why they are framed in this way. I want you to look at how the information is being presented, and I want you to pause it or to think about why it is presented in this way. And then I want you to think about how to factors such as genre, author, purpose, intended audience, how those things influence the way that the source presents its information or makes its claims. What roles do the source play in the larger conversation? You may use the brief evaluation from your annotated bibliography on that source as a starting point. So I said, don't worry so much about the page length. I want you to focus on the actual assignment. And the more I think about it, I'm going to provide something that I usually provide in English Comp 1. It's a PDF of important questions for rhetorical analysis. I'm going to put those in Blackboard underneath this assignment as well, or maybe I'll just attach it to this assignment so that you have it to work from. But the idea is you should be able to answer all of these questions. You should be able to deeply assess a particular source and understand how it's useful, why it's useful, why decisions were made. And the whole point of this is so that you can understand how your argument fits into the larger piece. Okay? That's the real reason why we do rhetorical analysis. We do critical analysis because we want to make sure, number one, our sources are good, but number two, we want to make sure that we are being an active part of this, not just a, one random off piece. So, like I said, you're going to choose one source and you're going to closely evaluate it. So, I do give you some questions to address, and I would tell you right now, if you just do these 4, you're going to have a really solid start to your critical analysis, because this is what it's asking you. Why and how evidence and conclusions are presented. So the first question that you should ask when you're looking and starting to evaluate a source is, what is the evidence? What are they putting forward? Once you know what the evidence is, and there might be more than one piece, then start asking, why is that evidence and conclusion? Why is that the choice? And then once you've said why, how is it being presented? Okay? How does Tappick and Kelp influence the format of writing? Which, again, is the rhetorical situation. We'll talk about it here in just a second. But I want you to think about, how do those factors influence the way that the source is written, the way that the information is presented? How does genre influence the format of writing? And brief recap, this is something that should have been taught in English Comp 1, or maybe taught in high school English or something like that. But genre is the type of writing. We think traditionally in the fiction sphere as, fantasy, science fiction, horror, all that stuff. But genre is also research essay, journal article, popular article. Those are genres as well. They're different, but they are a type of genre, and so that has an influence on the way it works. So you want to consider that as well. And this is something that you should definitely be thinking about, because it's going to be relevant for you, is what is the impact of that source on your topic? You know your topic. You chose your topic. What impact, what influence does the source that you chose to closely analyze, what influence does it have on your topic as a whole? Is it making big changes, or is it just making it easier for everyday people to understand? Those are important and very different strategies that need to be addressed. All right, now we're talking about Tappick and Kelp. Like I said, those of you who've had me before, you're familiar with this. Those of you who have not, welcome. So the rhetorical situation, in case you've forgotten between now and when you took English Comp 1 or anything like that, the rhetorical situation is the functions that arguments have. These are things that most arguments will feature in some way, shape, or form. The rhetorical appeals, which is Kelp, which is in the right-hand side, those are the ways that the author tries to appeal to their reader, trying to get them to care about the situation, try to care about whatever it is they're writing about. So rhetorical situation, rhetorical analysis is important because it's how arguments work. And so we want to make sure that we know what we're doing. And so, like I said, if you have a hard time remembering these things, I came up with 2 easy acronyms years ago. The first one was Tappick. Always remember, Tupac had a weird brother. His name is Tappick, and he's all about the rhetorical situation. Yes, that was the bad joke I used back in 2000 and, 18, 17? Yeah, still works today. But Topic is the rhetorical situation. It is your topic, your angle, your purpose, your audience, and your context. Topic, angle, purpose, audience, context. Pretty straightforward. So, as a recap, in case you've forgotten or it's been a while or whatever, so topic is the most obvious one. It is the topic. What is the topic of the piece that you are looking at? What is the whole point that they're trying to make? What are the main arguments? That's topic. Angle is known as bias. What we want to know from an angle is what type of bias, if any, does our source have? Is it coming from an angle where it says, yes, this is not a problem, we want to focus solely on it? Or is it coming from an angle of, well, this is a matter of serious importance and everybody should care about it, no matter who you are or where you live? And bias can play a large role, and so we want to be able to identify bias. Purpose is the reasoning or intent behind it. Every argument has a purpose. Whether that purpose is simply to inform, or that purpose is to manipulate, or that purpose is to persuade, whatever that might be, every argument has a purpose. So it's your goal, part of being a good critical thinker, critical reader, is to be able to identify the purpose, the intent behind a writing, by looking at it and seeing how do they phrase things. Are they trying to manipulate their audience? Or are they simply trying to present information in a new way or a simple way or a very complex way? Those things influence it. It's important to understand. Audience is perhaps one of the often forgotten ones, and I don't mean that as in people forget about the audience, but people tend to not focus on it. But believe it or not, the intended audience can say a lot and help inform the angle and the purpose of a piece. If you can identify who the intended audience is, you can then determine, well, does it have a particular bias or not? You can help find that quicker. You can also identify what was the intent behind it. If you're reading an article that was meant for a whole bunch of marine biologists and it's very intended to be super scientific and high, I'm going to tell you that the purpose behind it was not to inform the general masses. It's to have that conversation with experts. That means it's going to be very different than something that's meant to be read by, 13, 14-year-olds. The intended audience matters. This is why it's part of the rhetorical situation. We want to make sure that we're identifying who that intended audience is because it informs the other components. And then last but certainly not least is context. And context is kind of a catch-all for anything that's not already addressed. But context itself is also the background information that you need. What context does the source provide? Does it give you a brief history, or does it assume you already know everything about it? Is the source coming from a reputable location, or is it from across the world that has no real understanding of how that culture is? That's the context. That's important in understanding the relevance and the accuracy of a source. And so those are the rhetorical situation, but part of the rhetorical situation is also the rhetorical appeals. And so they're kelp, but they're four Latin words that people tend to either have heard once before or forgotten or never heard before, but it's kairos, ethos, logos, pathos. And typically when people are taught them, they're taught ethos, pathos, logos, or ethos, pathos, logos. It's a horse piece, doesn't matter how you pronounce it. But what is important is that these four do matter. Kairos means timing. And what this means is the timeliness of when this article came out. An example I like to use in all of my classes when talking about this, recently especially, is if you read an article about vaccines now versus an article about vaccines in the 1990s, those are two very different worlds. They're two very different views on vaccinations at this time. There's always been anti-vaxxers and there's always been super supportive pro-vaccines. But a post-2020 COVID world, vaccines have a whole different connotation and context than they did before. So that's an important Kairos, an important timing thing. Another point that I would like to make very specifically right now, and we're seeing, is again, there's always been issues of immigration, but conversations about immigration from 20, 30 years ago, very different than immigration conversations today in 2025. This is what I mean by timing matters. The world changes. Nothing stays the same. And so timing is relevant when we talk about accuracy, when we talk about relevancy. That matters. Okay? All right. So the other three, which are the ones that most people are taught, are ethos, logos, and pathos. Ethos is credibility, which comes down to ethics. Logos is logic or facts. And pathos is emotion. So I'm going to address these very quickly because these should have been addressed at other points in your academic career. Credibility, the ethos component of it, is just that, the credibility, the ethics of, is this an ethical source? Is this somebody who is actually knowledgeable, or are they untrustworthy? Ethos tends to be when you have resources, when you can say, oh, look, here's a citation for a source that I used. Oh, hey, I'm an expert. I've done research in this field for like 25 years. Here's my resume CV. Those are the credibility things that we look for in articles and sources. We want to see that the person talking about it is a credible source. They're not just, Mrs. Wheaton from from Northwestern Pennsylvania talking about the youth today in Chicago, Illinois. No offense, but Mrs. Wheaton does not know anything about the youth in Chicago, Illinois, because she's never been there. See how that makes sense? The credibility matters. Logos, logic or facts. This is if they are giving you absolutely hard data. They're saying, hey, here's a statistic about this. Hey, here's an image of this actual thing so you can see what's going on. It's the facts, things that you can verify, that oftentimes you verify through that credibility. Those two tend to work together really nicely. Pathos, the emotion. This is the one that is probably the easiest to identify in arguments. And honestly, I think it's probably the most fun because it's not that it is emotional writing. It's that the information incites an emotion in the reader. Okay? So if you're reading an article and they start talking about dead puppies and they're showing you injured dogs, that is an emotional appeal. They're trying to get you to feel some way about animals. If you're reading about terrible things that are being done to human beings today, and they show you pictures of the absolutely terrible conditions inside these prisons, guess what? That is an appeal to your emotions. That is trying to get you to feel a certain way so that you resonate with the piece. It is, and I will tell you this, and I don't mean it in a bad way with the negative connotations, but using pathos is manipulation. You are manipulating your audience to feel a certain way. Manipulation can be good or bad. I want to emphasize that. But when you do it to other people to get things your way, that's not a good thing. But my point being here is that the emotional appeal, you want to look for anything that incites feelings. If you're reading through a piece and you get angry about something, you found yourself something that's pathos, whether you've realized it or not. That's my best advice for people, is that as you're reading through something, if something makes you upset, excited, happy, grumpy, frustrated, sad, whatever emotion you feel, if you feel an emotion, immediately mark that down because that is an appeal to pathos. You can figure out why it is later, but if you feel something, latch onto it because that's going to help you. But that's pathos. So that's KELP. Kairos, ethos, logos, pathos. Those are your rhetorical appeals. They're the ways that we manipulate our reader to feel a certain way. And the rhetorical situation is both that and topic. Your topic, angle, purpose, audience, context. Those are your bread and butter. If you address all of those things for your critical analysis, you will be fine. If you address those and all of these questions, you will be fine. All right. Now, I want to briefly shift gears, and I do mean briefly because you should be aware of this, but we need to talk about summary, quote, paraphrase. Summary, quote, and paraphrase. Wow, apologies on that one. So, summary and quote are the two easy ones, and most people understand these pretty straightforward. If you remember, one of the things we're talking about is how to use your sources effectively, because we talked about critical analysis already. So now we're talking about the research paper itself. So you're going to want to use all the tools in your toolkit: summaries, your quotes, and your paraphrases. Summaries are your own words, and it's the important information. You want to use this to establish background or overview on a subject. You want to use summary to determine the main ideas of a single source. And you want to use summaries to describe info from various sources about a single topic. That's what summaries are supposed to be used for. When you want to talk generally about information from multiple sources or try to bring everything down into one point. That's the point behind a summary. The quote, on the other hand, is their own words, the original sources. It's info from the source. And when we use quotes, we are providing clear evidence of a claim. There's no ambiguity. It is exactly what the author said. There's no interpretation. It's right there. So sometimes we also do this to communicate in a specific way. Honestly, sometimes an author says something the exact way we want to. That's perfect. Quote it. There's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes we want to, as part of using examples, we want to provide a passage for analysis. Maybe something the author said is really important, but we need to dig into why it's important. Well, we might quote that section and then dive into it. And of course, the most popular way that I'm going to say right now will probably be used is to support claims you make about a source. If you want to say, yeah, this source said that this was absolutely a fact, you might support that with a direct quote from the source. So that's why I said summary and quote, we don't need to spend any time on. These are straightforward. Paraphrase, on the other hand, this is the one that students get confused. Paraphrase is like a beautiful in-between between a summary and a quote. Paraphrases are the exact meaning of what the author said, but in your words. You are not changing the meaning. You are not doing anything significantly to alter it. All you are doing is saying it in a different way. This oftentimes needs to be about the same length as the original. So when we use paraphrases, we're usually paraphrasing to further explain or simplify a passage, hence why I said your own words. Sometimes the author says something and you understand it, but you know that your audience might not, so you explain it in a different way. Honestly, a lot of what teachers do is paraphrasing. Teachers try to take all that information from a textbook. We summarize, we quote, and we paraphrase. We are trying to condense it all so that you get it. We summarize chapters, we quote certain sections and people because we want you to know that information directly, and we paraphrase. We take the hard, big, fancy words that we have degrees learning those, and we take them and try to apply them to you in an easier to understand way. That's why I said these are things that you can do and you do use, especially if you're a teacher, but that's neither here nor there. So yeah, to further explain or simplify a passage, we want to paraphrase. Another time we want to paraphrase is to establish our credibility. If you can paraphrase what an expert is talking about, that shows a level of credibility. You understand what they're saying, and you're able to return that information to somebody else in a different way. That's knowledge. That's credibility. So yes, we sometimes paraphrase to help establish our own ethos. Sometimes we're writing a whole lot about us and we're writing it in our voice, and all of a sudden we need to pull in a quote or a summary. Well, sometimes paraphrasing helps us maintain the flow of that writing so it sounds good rather than trying to just, yep, here's a quote, and it messes up the flow. We can paraphrase to eliminate less relevant information, and we can also use paraphrases to communicate relevant statistics and numerical data. Because if you get a big chart with a lot of data in a presentation, you show them the chart and the data. In writing, if you're writing an academic journal, you'll still provide the chart and data, but you'll still explain it. Same thing here. You're going to communicate what's important from a chart of data and give it to us where you explain what it's saying. You're not summarizing it, you're not quoting it, you're paraphrasing it. And perhaps the best advice I can give you about a paraphrase is to tell, not show. Showing is quoting. You're showing them exactly what it is. Telling them is the paraphrasing, explaining what it looks like. All right. So in case that wasn't a little tease, we're talking about using sources creatively now. And so I want to talk about specifically the essay structure. You heard me right. This is the final essay structure. I told you we'd be talking about it. Please note, there are 5 sections here in this little thing. The classic essay structure: introduction, background, confirmation, opposition, conclusion. Hear me closely. For our purposes, you do not need an opposition, but I will encourage it. We'll see how many people pay attention. Okay. So, honestly, a lot of this we can go through because a lot of this should be familiar to all of you. It might just be review. So an introduction is literally the start of your argument. The introduction section of an essay should always be this important moment where you're saying, hey, let me tell you about it. That makes sense. We all know what an introduction is. But it's important to note that a good introduction not only contains the thesis statement, they should always contain the thesis statement, but a good introduction will hook the audience. And what I mean by hook the audience is you get their attention. You not only get it, but you hold on to it. Because that's important. If you want your audience to read your writing, you want to make sure that they're invested. I'll be honest. I have to read your papers. That is my job as your teacher. But when you hook me, that's an even better time. Then I enjoy reading your paper, and it's not dreadful, and I don't feel like I'm pulling teeth at the dentist. A hook is a great way to engage your audience. Not just me, but anyone. And this is something I will say very specifically. Common ways to hook your audience are with an amusing anecdote or an interesting anecdote or a personal story. It can be through a direct quote. It can be through a thought-provoking question that you're going to answer. It can be with a shocking statistic or data figure that makes people go, wait, what? That's what a good hook does. It catches your audience's attention and it holds them just long enough that they're going to stick with you throughout your essay or through your argument. So, the next section is the background. And what's important here is that the background needs to provide what's needed, what's necessary. So the background's always the important information that your reader or your audience needs. One way I like to explain it is if you wanted to explain your topic to somebody who's never heard of your topic before, what do they need to know so they can understand what you're saying? So, bad example, but a personal example and one that I like to use in my classes normally. If I decide that I want to write an argumentative essay, research essay, on why Bulbasaur is the greatest starter of Pokemon Generation 1, Red, Blue, Yellow, Green, the Japanese exclusive, the remakes Fire Red and Leaf Green, if I wanted to make that argument, first, I would have to actually have some background where I explain what the heck is Pokemon, what the heck is a starter, and why does any of this matter? So then I would have to say, okay, well, Pokemon is a franchise, started in the early 1990s. In Japan, it's a traditional role-playing game monster catcher, which was inspired by bug catching, which is why there's a whole catching mechanic and there's a whole decent number of bug Pokemon in the first generation, and we need to explain what a Pokemon is, and that's short for pocket monster. It's a portmanteau shortened combined word to mean that they're pocket monsters, and the whole point of the game is to build a team of 6. You can have more than 6, but your team maximum is 6. Your goal is to go around the world, fight 8 strong trainers who are gym leaders, gather their gym badges, and take on the final 4, the Elite 4, and become the champion. That's the point of the game. And then because it's Pokemon, and anybody that knows Pokemon knows that you need to dive into, well, how does the game actually work? Well, there's an important mechanic. The battle mechanic is based off of a rudimentary rock, paper, scissors, where there's different types, and types have advantage and disadvantage. And you explain that how the 3 starters are grass, fire, and water, and they create a triangle of rock, paper, scissors, where grass is good against water but weak to fire. Water is good against fire but weak to grass. And fire is good against grass but weak to fire or water. And the cycle continues, and Bulbasaur is grass. And then, do you see what I mean? I know it's a ridiculous example, and I know definitely some of you kind of like zoned out there, and I apologize, but I'm a huge gaming nerd, and I'm actually a huge Pokemon nerd. You can't see it, but I have a whole collection of Pokemon plushes, including some custom-made ones. Anyway, not important. What is important is that background is the information that your audience needs. Provide them what they need to succeed. Because if you do not tell your reader what they need to know, your argument is going to fall flat. It might be important, and they might understand it's important, but they're not going to care if they don't know what they need to know. So, some important things that tend to be included in backgrounds. Please note, this is not everything that needs to be in the background, nor is this something that every background needs. These are just common things. Key people, places in the world and in time, which is also timelines. We need to know when things happen and when they end. And this one, I will tell you, this one is important. Key terms and definitions. If your subject has terminology or words or concepts that are not common to other areas, explain them. That is what the background is for, is to provide the context for your reader, for your audience. So, hopefully my Pokemon conversation helped with that. Then we get into the confirmation, which is your argument. This is the body. So if we think about the essay as the intro and the background are the beginning, here's the big chunk. Your confirmation should be the big chunk of your paper. And this is where we want to organize it into topics and subtopics. And all this is the main points of argument. What exactly are you trying to say? What is your evidence? What are you supporting your main point, your argument? That's all this is. That's what the body is. And I want to emphasize, examples are not topics or subtopics. If you have examples, that's great, but they are not topics. They are examples. They're evidence. You need to take that evidence and connect it to a subtopic, to an argument. Does that make sense? Hopefully it does. All right. Opposition or digression. And honestly, this is why I said I'm going to encourage it, but it is not required. The opposition is quite literally the opposite of your argument. And there are ways to do this. You can refute, you can concede, or you can ignore the opposition. When you refute, you are fighting or opposing the argument. The opposition says something and you're like, no. Let me tell you why it's completely wrong. That's what you do when you refute. When you ignore, you just don't engage. You don't even bring it up. And when you concede the argument, you are agreeing. But please note, I'm not saying you agree fully. There are issues, which is why I have its own little bullet point. Yeah, but if you use a concession, you concede your argument to an opposing point, you want to say, yes, they're right. But, and you want to bring it back to your point. Because if you simply just agree with the counter opposite, or the counter argument, are you making an argument anymore? You don't want to give up, but you don't want to ignore it. It's a very, very, very fine line. And I emphasize that. The other thing I want to say about the opposition or digression is there are ways to do this that flow naturally, and there are ways to not do this. Like I said, not everybody needs to do this. I'm not going to make you do an opposition section in your essay, but I will highly encourage it. And if you're not sure how it works or how yours is working or shaping out, feel free to reach out to me. I will be glad to give you some advice based off of your argument. I'm not going to give you general advice. I need to have specifics so I can say, okay, how you might approach this is, and explain it there. And then last but not least is the conclusion. And the conclusion you want to wrap up, literally wrap up. You might reword your thesis and you end with a call to action or a call for more research. Please note, no new information. You should not bring up any new changes or any new information you didn't include anywhere else in the essay in their conclusion. That's bad writing. End it on a high note. So, how do we use it source creatively? Because I just went over the overall structure of the essay, so how the heck do we use it? Well, honestly, we can use sources in just about every section of our essay. But if we want to use them creatively, we might want to use them most efficiently in our body, in our digression if we have it, in our intro. Because one way we can use sources very creatively is through case study, where we use one source as kind of an example that we go through the steps of what we're talking about and we analyze it. So following one source throughout the argument, maybe you have one argument that is a really good example of a problem that you want to address. Use it as a case study. Say, okay, let's look at the history of this particular battle in World War I and why it's relevant and important to all of these different factors that I'm making. That's a case study following that one source throughout multiple pieces. That's a great way to use a source creatively. Another way, honestly, is collaboration. Show how multiple sources support the same point. Bring in different voices. Say, hey, this expert writing 40 years ago is saying the same thing that somebody 2 years ago is saying from a completely different part of the world. And there's also this one person who's doing research now and they're talking about this. Bring in those voices. As long as they're all working together, that's a great way to use them in a different way than just, and this is my point, and here is an expert that said the same thing that I said, and moving on to the next one. Have fun with it. Mapping, showing how one informs the other. If you have sources that literally built off of the work of previous ones, that's a really cool thing in research where you can say, hey, John Smith wrote this thing in 1890, and in 1940, this researcher actually pulled from Smith's work and wrote this on it. And then this guy in the 1960s worked on this piece, and then in the 1980s, and now actually in 2025, this guy is writing about this. And that's awesome. Showing how one piece informs the other and creates this kind of flowchart map. That's a really good way to use your sources in more than just here's a quote from them. I hope you're understanding what I'm saying with this. So the reason I mentioned the introduction, because those are great ways to do it through the body. You can do this not just in the intro, you can do it throughout, but telling a story. Sometimes having a source that is helpful in informing the audience and giving them a well-rounded picture of things or helping create a visual or an example. Telling a story is great, and using a source that helps do that is even better. And another really good way of using a source is to help visualize data or concepts. If you are talking about something and you know it's just difficult to kind of explain it, pull in a source that explains how it works or shows how it works. Because I can't believe I have to say this in the year 2025, but resources that you use for research don't just have to be writing. They can be lectures, they can be interviews, they can be movies, they can be shows, they can be art pieces, music. If you want to help visualize a concept and you're having a hard time figuring it out, but some artist really did a good depiction of abstract how it feels, include their artwork. Visualize the concept. If there's a YouTube educational video meant for like high school kids that explains a difficult concept, use it. Use that source. That's a creative use of sources, and it's a way to help explain something to your audience. I cannot emphasize this enough because too many people get focused on the academic source and think I have to use only essays, only books. No. There's a whole host of information out there. Use what you can to help make your audience understand your point. So, this brings us to our 2 essays for this week. Essay 25, Hope and Mourning in the Anthropocene, and Essay 36, Scientific Messages Across Human Nature. So I did want to say real quickly, the Anthropocene I really appreciate is the quote-unquote current geological era. So anybody who knows geology and knows the study of rocks and things like that and understands, the different sediment layers and things like that, this is just a fun thing for you, if not, whatever. But they talk about a term in this article called ecological grief, which is quite literally what it sounds like. It's the fact that our planet also goes through the same type of mourning and pain that humans do, and we're going to address that here in just a second because I'm going to ask the why this article for both at the same time. So essay 36 is about this, how we share scientific messages across human nature. Because here's the reality, and I've been saying this for years, we are living currently in a post-truth era. What this means is that right now, people care more about their personal feelings and thoughts than they care about facts and data. So, this whole thing is talking about overcoming biases and understanding how human nature plays an impact in how we hear about scientific research. I would argue, if you have heard or read or seen anything about the flat Earth, you are aware of this issue of human nature and scientific messaging. Okay? So why these articles? Why did I ask you to read these for this week? Well, for 3 reasons. Number 1, you can critically analyze both of these, and they're both really good, but they're probably not relevant to anyone's research papers, so you shouldn't do it, but I'm saying these are 2 really good examples of how to do that. But, number 2, one of the reasons I picked both of these is because both of them have to do with difficult scientific concepts. One's more psychological but science-based. One is very science-based. But hopefully, if you read through both of these essays, you will have understood that they're fairly easy to read. They're not like super high above everybody, like, oh, well, here's these big fancy words I'm not going to explain to you, and if you're not an expert in this, you're not going to... No, they explain science in a very easily understandable way. And again, reminding you about topic and kelp, your topic, angle, purpose, audience, concept, kairos, ethos, logos, pathos. These are great ways to show you how you can take difficult concepts like grief and geology and psychology and essentially bias and how we can address those things in a different way. It's very important. And third reason, so first is critical analysis. Second is because they are good ways and examples of having these types of information or this type of information available and more understood to people. But third, if you were conducting research on one of these topics, these sources are academic, but they are also popular in the way that they're discussed. Sometimes when we look for information, when we look for essays or examples to use for resources, we get caught up on the wrong thing. Look for something that is engaging, interesting, and informative. Both of these are very good examples of that. So hopefully you understood that the reason I wanted you to look at these, and if you're watching this lecture before you read any of this stuff, please still read through the things. I realize as I talk about them, I don't dive deep into any of the essays because I want you to read them. I go over the high-level content for them because I want you to read them with the context that I'm giving you of, hey, this is good for what we're talking about, how we address this, how we write this, how we think about this. I want you to read through these and see how they address difficult concepts because you should be doing the same with your own writing. If you have difficult concepts, how do you address them? All right. That being said, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Like I said, the critical analysis is not due this week, but next week. This week is the annotated bibliography is due by the end of the week. Outside of that, good luck, and I'll see you in the next video.